Hello, I'm Holo74, back with another episode. This time, we're going to be using Godot. Godot, one of the two. I've heard it pronounced either way. Both ways are probably correct. However, we'll be doing Godot C Sharp. They've recently implemented this into 3.1.1 Mono. You'll want to go to Godot's website and download the mono version. That's the only version that's compatible with C Sharp right now. With that, you want to do a new project, browse into whatever thing you're trying to do. Let's say testing. What you can do is you can go into the browse, you can create a folder, do testing, select, enter, and it'll start. Alright, so we're back to here. We've selected browse. Now we want to go to 3.0 if we're just going to be making games, tools, software, whatnot. However, as this one says, if you're going to be making any web browsing games or web games, you're going to want to go to 2.0. Now, we're going to do create and edit. Currently, C# isn't fully supported. There's still some things here and there that aren't going to transfer over very well. What is currently not working, I'm not sure, as all the features I've used are currently really good, or so I would assume. Now, the root node of the scenes can sort of be seen as what perspective do we want to take? Do we want this to be a user interface, a 2D scene, or a 3D scene? Or if you want your own, such as an isometric scene that's not pre-built into the 2D scene, or if we want something different completely, I haven't delved too much into it, this would be your way. However, I would assume that's a lot more advanced than what I'm going to teach in at least this video, and it might be even more advanced than what I'd recommend if you're just barely starting out. Now, we'll go for 2D. And coming over from Unity, the 2D scenes are very similar in functionality to Unity's own thing, except there is one major difference. Let's say I want a sprite. So we'll search for sprite. Here's our sprite. There's not really a texture on it because I don't have any textures. However, that's not what we'd first do to make a sprite. In fact, we'd probably get a rigid body from it first. A rigid 2D body. Now the reason for that is because we need stuff to underlie it. And this is where we'd get the sprite. With inside a rigid body 2D, we'd be able to select all the things. Is a character, controller. I haven't delved too much into rigid bodies yet, and I haven't delved too much into creating full games with this, but I have spent roughly 2 to 3 months working with it. So I've explored around, done a couple different things, and rigid bodies act fairly similar to this. The only difference is, I would say, the 2D aspect of Godot or Godot is a lot better to Unity's. It was made for 2D, whereas Unity's is sort of slapped on using a 3D engine. There's gravity, physics, weight, angular, collision. There's layers, sort of like layer masking, which is already pre-built in, and you can sort of say, oh, this player will be on all of these. Well, we're only going to check for collision if the layer is on layer 1 or bit 0. So layer masking is quite good in this one as well. Pickupable, not entirely sure what it is, but you could definitely just hover over it and it would give you a little thing right there. This can be detected by mouse pointers entering and leaving, and it says that it will report an event. Now those events can be found under the Nodes tab, which is right next to the inspector. And for that, we're going to say, mouse entered. This is going to be added saying, okay, let's say there's a method in 2D where if a mouse enters into the collision box, it will then go to the script that is attached to the node or the root of the scene, and the method name will be whatever you type in right here. So it'll go to the script over and say, okay, let me actually demonstrate this. And along with that, you can see here's the visibility. You can see there's a light mask. Godot has a very good lighting system for 2D where it can do essentially a lot of things, which deserves a video of its own. There's physics, and however, it's still complaining that we need a shape. That's because we need to go into here and say collision shape 2D. Now, this one says, alright, which shape do we want? Let's say we want a new rectangle shape. Now, you can use middle mouse button to scroll in, and if you hold in the middle mouse button, you're able to scroll or pan. It's a interesting thing, and right click doesn't really do anything. Middle mouse or left click does one of the functionalities from up here, which can be dragging and dropping or selecting everything. I recommend one of the things that was frustrating the most is I was on selection when, let's say, I wanted to move the rigid body. Well, instead of moving the rigid body, I'd move the collision shape because I was on selection. Now, if you want to move just the rigid body and definitely know you're going to be moving the rigid body, you want to go over here to the move mode. There, you can move everything. And the sprites will always be followed by the parent. And if you move the node, it's essentially parents and childs in Unity, where they share some similar properties. While they're independent, they also share position, rotation, transformation, a lot of stuff like that. You can also go over to rotation and be like, okay, yep, rotate that, and scaling. Most of this can be transferred over from Unity fairly easy. The one thing that is a bit frustrating is using the debugger. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to use it quite as much because unlike, not that I found currently, when you launch a scene from either pressing F6 to play the current scene or pressing F5 to play the very beginning of the game, there really isn't a way to go into scenes and see exactly what has changed. Let me just, yep. And this is how you would save. You just create a new folder and do scenes. Okay, and this is a Node 2D scene. Oh, save. And in here, you can sort of see remote. And this is how everything is sort of done. You can see all the changes that happened here, and you can say, okay, let's say I want to move it by a certain X or Y position, or I want to change how tall it is or how wide it is. You can do it over in the remote. However, local will only change the scene that isn't being played. You then come back over here and say, okay, well, I'm done with this. Done. And creating scripts is also quite simple as well. As you'd go over here and say, okay, let's do a new folder and do scripts. And as far as I know, I'm not sure if there are specific folder names, like in Unity, where if you had the editor, none of the editor would transfer over, or if you had another folder name that was similar to it, you wouldn't have it transfer over. Or essentially, I haven't seen any example of it, and I'm not entirely sure if there is. However, there is one exception to this. When you're making script folders, or folders that contain any sort of script that you want to add, do ensure that there's no special characters in the script folder, that there's no spaces in the script folder, that there's no, like, let's say instead of scripts, and you would have to go in and rename it, let's say scripts for player. If you try to rename it to something like that, you will get an error. It took me too long to figure out that this is what the error was for. However, if your folder name has spaces in it, it will compile an error, which is very frustrating. Along with that, if you want to do anything with the editor, such as if you want to give the rigid 2 body a custom variable, or a variable that you can change essentially through just the inspector, it is possible. It's very similar to serializable, from Unity, except you would have to come over to the mono tab, which not entirely sure where it is right now. But let's say, for now, let's just ignore that. Script, instead of node base, it's C#. And we're going to call this player move. And just like scripts, you can't have spaces in your scripts either. That's common practice in Unity, or at least I believe it is. It's going to be deriving from essentially, you can say, okay, what is this script going to be deriving from? Because it automatically picks something. Now, you are able to go into your own folders and select a script name and be like, okay, yep, it derives from this one, or it derives from this one. So that way, it automatically sets up the environment for you to use it. But this time we're going to be using a node 2D. Or actually, we could say it compiles from a rigid body 2D, which is right up there. Alright, template is default, and whoops, I clicked out of it. Alright, and the language that we're using is not GD script, Visual Script, or C. We're using C#. Create that. Now it's generating the solution, and we get the mono tab right here. Now, if we want those custom variables over on the side, we're going to want to click the build project. Unfortunately, with the build project, and I'll demonstrate this later, if you already have something in there and you've added like another thing that's serializable, or what they do in Godot, which is export, it will get rid of it. So you will need to reinstate it. I had a couple of errors there as well. And unfortunately, unlike Unity, Godot, as far as I know, you can only have one script per body, essentially. So you'll need a lot of more modularity and a lot more object orientation, instead of just being like, here's a dozen scripts on one thing. You'll want to plan it out and be like, okay, I can't have a dozen scripts, but what can I have? And then from here, if you try to open this now, and I'm not sure if it will do it here. No, it doesn't. You also want to download Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code are completely different. Visual Studio is an IDE that helps you. Visual Studio Code is essentially a text editor, sort of like Notepad++ or Notepad, but it takes the visuals from Visual Studio Code and implements it. it also allows you to get extensions onto your thing. So if you want to say, oh, I want a C# extension that helps you write C#, or I want like the basic thing that understands it, then you'll have to add on. And the current one that's open is this. Now, there's a couple things with Godot where it doesn't necessarily use, or actually, before that, I'll show you how to set up the project. Once you've installed it, you want to go down here to okay. So instead of it being in the project, it's in the editor. And in editor, you'll scroll all the way down to editor. And we're using an external editor. And instead of using if you want to use MonoDevelop, you can select it right here, but you'll have to install it manually, along with Visual Studio Code. Or if you want to use the native script editor that doesn't have C# support, you can use Godot's own text editor. Personally, I prefer Visual Studio Code. They are implementing, and from what I believe, they're implementing Visual Studio. They're adding support for Visual Studio. So that way we don't have to use Visual Studio Code. And then from here, we can say, okay, now that we have this pulled up, ready is sort of like the start method in Unity, except it's typed a lot differently. It's typed public override void ready. Now, that comes from over here. Without this, we aren't able to do this, the public override. That's because there's a virtual method in here that automatically starts and is called to and is already compiled. Whereas in here, it isn't. We override it. We make it do different things. Now there's a couple different things. Void, and most of them start with the underscore. Now coming from Unity, that's a bit different, and it doesn't give you any recommendations right off the bat. At least mine doesn't. You might set up Visual Studio Code in a different way. You might have different things set up, which allows for something like that. However, unfortunately, I don't. If you want something that is sort of like Unity's awake function, or not necessarily awake, but the thing that starts before start, which I've used a lot, and unfortunately, I don't remember offhand. You use enter the tree or enter tree. This isn't as sure because it might say, oh, well, it's already been in the tree, or essentially the ready function is what you'll want to be using the most. However, enter tree is one node such as this. Let's say that wasn't in the scene before, but you created it through script. Well, it's just entered into what we call the tree hierarchy. The root is right here, and then if it enters into this main root, or becomes a child to the root, that's what we call entering the tree. And then you can be like, okay, done. Now, that's fun and all. However, what if I want a private int speed factor? But I want to test it. I want to test it in the editor, and I want different things to be happening. Well, unlike Godot's own scripting language, where you would add it before the private or after the private, one way or the other, I'm not entirely sure of. You would type it just like you would type it in Unity, where it's like serializable, but instead of serializable, it's export. Now, unlike in Unity, it doesn't automatically build. You have to do build project. And then here's script variables. We're able to go in here and be like, okay, I want a 10. Now, if I'm correct, you should be able to come into here and say, okay, Unfortunately, I am not correct. You have no access to the scripting variables on runtime or when you're playing the game. Which unfortunately is a bit down. However, Godot's still in its early stages. It's still trying to get things done and ready. We currently don't need this, so we're just going to do underscore process. Now this, the float delta, that's sort of how much time it takes between each frame. So it's sort of like the time.delta time from Unity, except it's showing that it happens immediately right here. So with this, we can say, is action pressed? Yep, there. And then with that, we can say, oh, well, I don't entirely know what I want, but, and this is to demonstrate my earlier point. We have 10 in speed right here. We come over here and we can say, oh, well, I want private, or, oops, I want another variable export. Private string key move. Or forward key. And then we just replace that with this, with the forward key. Now we come back over here, and since it's C#, we want to build the project, but that's, okay, apparently it stays. Alright, apparently it stays. I believe that was actually for another thing, which I'll have to be going through. Let's say forward. And then with the project settings, we'll say, okay, input map. There's already a ton of things, and all their names are set right here. So these are the names, and it's recommended that you don't necessarily use their things, because it might not serve exactly what you want. However, you can say, well, I want the forward key, and add. Well, now you've added it. And if you want like a key and let's say W, you're able to add however many things you want: a mouse button, joystick button, axis, another key. And now forward can be renamed. Unfortunately, these can't be renamed or deleted at all. There's no option to delete them. Let's go in and let's say texture. Let's just do a new image. Come into here and say, okay, icon, there we go. That didn't work. Okay. Let's see if we can't load it like that. There we go. And then there's the collision shape, which they recommend you don't scale, you only drag. So now we have our image in. And just for sake of showing, let's turn off gravity. That's not turning that off, that's making you fly. Pressed F6. And there's our little guy up there. Now let's say you're like, but where's the camera? This thing doesn't come with a camera. Well, yeah, it does. The camera right here is your screen resolution current. There we go. You have to press the current button. Yep. There we go. And now it's kind of boring having just like a picture right there. So let's have an environmental scene. Let's have a tile map. Now tile maps are pretty interesting in that they take a lot of setup, but after they've taken the setup, you can essentially do whatever you want with them. So we'll do a tile set, and just, yeah, a new save tile will work. You go into here, and you're like, okay, well, of course, I want to add like tiles to things. And there's these two arrows button down here. So you're like, okay, well, I've added it. And then add a thing into it. There. And I added it through this plus button down in the bottom left corner. And I have a thing. You can do auto tiling, you can do an atlas, or you can just do a single tile. And you can be like, okay, well, I don't want to like miss a thing. So it automatically detects a good boundary, and you can just be like, okay, there we go. Here is my new tile. But that's the region of which the tile occupies. What if we want collision? Well, we can go in here and be like, well, I don't want to create my own collision. I'm just going to go in here and select using the box. Or you can do this and be like, well, maybe I want something like, yeah, I want only like that section to not have collision. I'm just going to delete that. Alright. And it automatically snaps if you did the snapping. And there's the collision. Convex, concave. I'm not entirely sure what the difference is. However, looking a bit more into the documentation, you might be able to find out. And I just want this to be an entire box. So there we go. And occlusion is sort of what areas can't be filled with light. So let's say we want like light to appear down here, but we don't want light to appear up here. Or we don't want light shining through this way, but we want light shining through this way. We can just be like, oh, well, whoops. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure if it works that way or if it's one way or if you're using the tile maps for that, but there's navigation as well. And with that, we're done with making the tiles. And we can go back over to our nodes and say, okay, tile maps. And then you just take your new tile set, drag and drop into here and say, okay, there we go. Just paint in. And there's a lot more tutorials on this. And then go back over to our script and say, all right, well, we did the movement key. We have our speed. We have the rigid body. And we can just say transform dot. Give me a sec. I'll be right back. It wasn't the rigid body. It's a kinematic body, apparently. And it's move and slide. Now let's say vector 2. For this, we'll just do vector 2 dot up. And since it's move and slide, it's already taken into account delta. So you don't need to add or times by delta again. And this already slide, I'm not entirely sure if it counts for collisions, but I do know that collide does. So if you want collisions to be in there as well, and you don't want objects phasing through the terrain, you'll do move and collide, which is essentially move and slide, but with collisions. And since we have a kinematic body, we actually don't want this. And if you delete the node, everything under it is destroyed. Kinematic body 2D. And then we'll do a collision shape. Shape 2D. And then we'll have a new circular shape. And of course we need a sprite. And since the only texture we have here is the icon. Yep. And then we can go down onto scripts and just be like, there we go. Oh. We're going to have to drag that down. There we go. And that is the tutorial. Thank you for coming. If you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them, and see you next time.